Hello, it's Aaron Renn. Welcome back to the show. My special guest today is Robert Ordway. He is a policy wonk, I guess maybe the best way to describe him, who spent the last several years working for Senator, now Governor Mike Braun of the state of Indiana. He's a man after my own heart in that he previously owned a men's haberdashery and still, I believe, has a custom men's tailored clothing company that he runs. And he's the author of a very interesting piece that I put up on my own Substack about the multiracial working class. And I wanted to get him on to talk more about that. So there's a link to that article in the show notes. We won't regurgitate everything that was in it. We'll cover a little bit of it, but hopefully have a little more expansive conversation. So, Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Aaron, thanks for having me on the show.
One thing that strikes me about you is you're a lifetime member of both the NAACP and the NRA. The overlap of people who are life members of both organizations probably isn't that big. Uh, so, how do you explain your orientation on that?
Yeah, that's a hard question right out of the gate. I think the only other person I know that might be both members is State Senator Ed Charbonneau in Valparaiso, who used to be a lobbyist for U.S. Steel, Gary Works. So maybe that was part of the job. But anyway, I think research over history, growing up next to Gary, understanding the foundation of civil rights in the NAACP, and Gary was started around 1916, and Gary's first three African American councilmen were Republicans in the 1920s. And so the more I got to learn about the city and its people, it sort of made sense. And also when it comes to fundraising, with the Supreme Court decision, the NAACP was the one that really championed, the privacy of donors because of, folks going after them and stuff. And so I don't always agree with organizations as they become state and nationally oriented, but I can tell you, after joining the NAACP down back in 2012 and going to the Gary dinners at the Genesis Center, one of the worst things about the organization is the people who go are way better dressed than me. It's not even close. In that it's very Italian in the sense of the hyper individualism and the men's style. But I'll tell you that those dinners and the keynote speakers that they had, often from Chicago, tended to resonate with a lot of their message, which was a little bit race oriented, but really focused on working class kitchen table issues. So that's one piece. And then on the NRA thing, became a lifetime member back in 2010. And I was raised with quite a few guns with my dad, hunting and fishing. Dad was a jokester, a fun guy, but when it came to firearms, took it very, very seriously. And so, I think the Second Amendment's a pretty big deal. And my dad was always like, every gun, if I hand it to you, you don't trust me. You treat every gun as if it were loaded. Always check it. You never point at anything you don't intend to kill. So I think when it comes to our rights, the implied component too is our responsibilities. So I think both those organizations have a long history of promoting the individual as well as the community. And yeah, it does seem a little bit of a maybe juxtaposition or maybe not normal, but I think there's something to be said for the history of our country and the freedoms that we have and that we need to protect.
I think Barry Goldwater was a life member of the NAACP and may have even won like some kind of lifetime achievement award for them, which is telling you something because I believe he was sort of a principled objector to the Civil Rights Act, but he
Yeah.
was also very well known for his advocacy for civil rights for Black people in Phoenix and in the Arizona area. And of course, he had some discrimination himself because he was half Jewish and was blackballed from institutions on account of that himself. But there's at least one other kind of very conservative guy who was also a life member of the NAACP. You mentioned growing up in Gary. How did your family get to Gary, Indiana?
Yeah, well, the family came over as indentured servants back in the mid 1600s from Worcestershire, England. Yes, that's where the sauce was created, right around the time of the English Civil War. And they spent about 100 years in New Massachusetts Bay County with a half step in New Hampshire. And then a guy named Sergeant John Ordway, decided to join this thing called the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that took him across the country. And when he got back, the feds gave him some land in the Louisiana Territory, which is now Missouri. I believe they call it New Madrid. And so essentially recruited some siblings, and then one died. The widow moved over to Western Kentucky, and they were there for 150 years in Caldwell and Crittenden County up until the 19 about 55, from what I can see in my research. After my papa came back from the Korean War, he realized that Western Kentucky was the exact same in 1955 that it was, in literally 1800 when it was the Western frontier, minus all the bandits along the Ohio River. And so, the South was really falling behind in income and opportunity, and the mechanization of farming took my great grandpa into a place where he was a fluorspar miner part time while running a farm. And so Papa Hollis decided to pick up his wife and his very young daughter and headed up where they would call one of the quote unquote hillbilly highways up US 41, and took him essentially straight to Gary, where he quickly was employed at the Gary Sheet and Tin Mill. And over time, my dad was born just a couple years later, and then they bought a house in East Gary, which is now Lake Station. When my grandparents retired back to Western Kentucky in about 87, after 33 years in the steel mill, I was raised in the exact same house that my dad was. And so there's certainly a transplanted Southern agrarian culture and history, in my backyard, with a lean to tin shed, a red barn, a burn barrel, and coincidentally a garden that we had. So it's a very unique history that most people who are in and around Gary would not say that's pretty not common.
Yeah, and you make the point in your piece that your people were different than J.D. Vance's people from Eastern Kentucky.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think the researchers were mostly from Ohio, and they were, Appalachia actually extends multiple states. And as they were looking at, Appalachia being, probably the most disadvantaged part of the country, not easy to, raise animals or grow vegetation and what have you. And so those folks that moved north at the beginning of the turn of the 20th century, again, they would call them hillbillies. They were fairly, to some degree, unreliable workers, not because they didn't work hard. There's some stereotypes out there, but really they missed home. But those researchers also looked, out west, and they were called the Okies, right? The folks from Oklahoma went out to California, but there was a group in the middle that nobody looked at, other than author Chad Berry from Southern Migrants, Northern Exiles, great book from 2000. And he called these people the Flatlanders. And they're very different than Eastern Kentucky, because when you think about the Heartland, the coal strikes and the wars and what have that they were having over there at the exact same time in Western Kentucky, where there was what they call brown coal or the fluorspar mines, there was no unionization and no strikes of that nature. And so some of that has to do with the folks that were more WASP in their history migrating down the Ohio River. But Western Kentucky was teetotaler, Baptist and Methodist up until 2019. So I would say the culture and persona between Eastern and Western Kentucky, albeit white since the Civil War, like noticeable differences. However, when those folks migrated north, if they had a Southern, accent or twang, they were just deemed "quote unquote" hillbillies, because that's what popular media, in their research, if you will, had kind of put them all in one bucket. And so I think one of the challenges that I've had in my research is that, I've read all the same books that J.D. Vance read for his memoir, and you find that it was like, well, they were racist. Well, they were not racist. Well, they worked hard. Well, they didn't work hard. Or they were cheap. Well, they were loose with their money. And so you read all these opposite opinions. So you have to try to come to the realization: is this just anecdotal, or were the people really truly diverse in some of their personal habits as they went about living? So, but yeah, I would certainly say the Western Kentuckians have a pretty different background and history than and my family are from what's called the Black Patch, which is one of the was the nation's top tobacco growing area, and it would produce what 40% of the world's supply. And then there was something called the Black Patch Tobacco Wars that was very close to where my great grandparents lived, and it was essentially because it was one of the first monopolies in the country with the American Tobacco Company, and folks basically started fires, and there was kind of it definitely wasn't the farmer socialist movement out in the Dust Bowl, but there was definitely this anti-corporate sentiment as they were leveraging, on farmers as mechanization was getting, instituted everywhere and really, I wouldn't say taking away people's jobs, but it certainly the family farm was nowhere near the ability to be profitable, especially if you had several kids and then you had to split up that plot. The math doesn't math, and that jives right with your Eastern and Southern Europeans that came over who had similar, economic related challenges.
Yeah, the way you talked about your father and guns, it's like high conscientiousness, very different than what you stereotype of Eastern Kentucky, and to be sure. So you grew up in Lake Station, and like the house your grandparents had bought there,
Mhm.
uh, originally called East Gary, or was called East Gary at one point.
Yep.
And so when what era did you grow up in, and then what was your experience growing up in this sort of working class steelworker, I guess, town?
Yeah. Well, the history is kind of fascinating because North Lake County along Lake Michigan is considered Indiana's last frontier. It was originally, Native Americans, uh, several different groups, but then the French fur traders were coming in the 1600s. As a Chicagoan said it would never become anything in the 1800s, and there was a former Indiana senator that said basically Northwest Indiana was useless, given the wild animals and the sand dunes and everything. It was pretty just hard to navigate. You can tell that by the roads today that were developed by the Native Americans. They don't make sense when you look at the direction, but they really just had to go what was the path of least resistance. But Lake Station, again, ironically, the very first train station at the terminus along the lake, in the mid 1850s, and an Englishman, George Earl, developed the community that I'm originally part of. It's a neighborhood called Liverpool, after in England, and the community just totally failed a couple years later, just because George Pullman couldn't strike a deal, and he went to the south side of Chicago, and then Crown Point, a city not too far away, went to the downstate, and they ended up having the county seat moved, and so the community died. 50 years later, his grandson George Earl, his grandson, they developed Hobart, call it the Brickies because there was a lot of clay there and they made bricks. Comes back, renames Lake Station East Gary in 1908, and they literally think about this: cars barely exist, and they're marking this as a suburb. And for folks who know the history of Northwest Indiana, the definition, the region, really is the only four industrial cities: East Chicago, Whiting, Gary, and Hammond. So East Gary Lake Station is the other northern community, but it was really piecemealed because it's greenways and blueways. There was no real industrial, footprint or background, and so it was sold as this kind of agrarian, feeling, slow-paced way of life outside of the city. And so, but it failed again in 1908. They didn't recruit any CEOs or executives like they had hoped to. So it failed again. And then so you fast forward another 50 years when my grandparents show up on the scene. And finally, the folks that couldn't afford Gary or again wanted to be kind of off the beaten path moved to East Gary, which, maintained that name up until it was basically the 100-year anniversary, or excuse me, 200-year anniversary of our independence. So 1976, East Gary's like, well, Gary's kind of going downhill. We should change our name. And they actually thought about calling it Independence. And then I guess they resorted back to their old name, Lake Station. But, I moved there when I was 4 in 1989. And, having a childhood in the 90s is pretty wild up there because, Gary had, in the night from 1980 to 1990, folks don't talk about how white flight was already, it had already completed its course. But the steel industry, and my dad was one of the, we use the word victim, but he was one of the folks that, lost his job at U.S. Steel during the mass consolidation. But for Black Americans, the Chicagoland area is the number one part of the country for an exodus. And so, Gary lost a ton of its population from the time I was born forward. And in the mid 90s, they called it, the murder capital of the nation, which statistically I don't agree with because Gary was just barely over 100,000 people, and that's what you need to be considered in that grouping. But the reality is, there's several other bigger cities that had a lot of crime and murder in a very concentrated area. But statistically, it's offset by the affluent areas. Again, pick on a Detroit or a Chicago, a New York City, and so I think Gary, you know, got that bad rap, and unfortunately, folks have used ruin porn and other negative attributes in the Google algorithm to kind of keep the city's image and branding down. But living on the other side of I-65, I was on what I call the color line. I was one of the first white families on the Englehart subdivision, which was developed in the early 40s. The house that I grew up in was one of four that they built in 57, but they never completed the subdivision. So I grew up around a bunch of sand and trees. So I had a very, again, East Gary, it felt like I was, basically in the wilderness, which was pretty neat. But the reality is, questions started to arise for me personally when on TV, all my favorite athletes, like, Michael Jordan was in his heyday in the mid 90s. Chris Rock was a comedian. I was listening at that point by 96, 97, I'm listening to, Tupac Shakur and, Bone Thugs and Harmony and what have you. And so all of my favorite musicians, actors, and athletes are all black. But then when my dad and I helped two Hungarian brothers build their houses, one we went east to Chesterton, and the other we went west into the Black Oak neighborhood of Gary. I saw drug dealers and prostitutes in broad daylight, at the age of 11, 12 years old. And so, that probably planted the seed of trying to reconcile seeing the 1% of Black Americans at the top, but then seeing the 1% at the very bottom. And so I think my childhood and my friends as well are in a kind of a unique enclave that, probably doesn't exist in a lot of parts of the country.
Yeah, what kind of values do the people who grow up in a place like Lake Station uh, pick up? Kind of either implicitly or explicitly as you're growing up.
Yeah, well, most of the folks that did work in the mills, they were, on the lower rung of the ladder. They were millwrights, labor gangs, things of that nature. They were not foremen or anyone in higher blue collar society. That's actually a thing. You'd be surprised. Even within using your hands, there's still a bit of a hierarchy when you're a union member and some of those other things. But one thing that I noticed, particularly about the folks I grew up in my high school, is that we didn't really know anything about race or ethnicity from a sense that there was this history because in the 90s, the internet really doesn't exist, right? You only know the people on your block. And, it cost 20 cents to call my mama in Kentucky. So when I did that, or when I went down there every summer and called back, it was like, Robert, make sure you know what you said. We only have $1 for this phone call. So you get 5 minutes. So, make whatever you say count. So you have to think of the we use the word primitive communication, but we didn't know anything about the history of civil rights or women's rights or any of these things, and so we only knew what the CDs and music we listened to, and maybe MTV told us, and so it was kind of interesting to have a crude steelworker language where kids cussed and said kind of ethnic and racial slurs towards each other, but it was always in jest. It was never really to hurt someone or put them down. And so the things that we said in the 90s, and Rob Henderson mentions in his memoir Trouble that basically the way we talked in the 90s would totally get you canceled really quickly here. But I think one of the things to be understood is that the work ethic, not knowing that you're part of the lower social class, other than maybe playing some other kids from schools, but we were 1A. So we would have to drive a school bus an hour away out into the sticks of Indiana to play other 1A schools, which were
That's the
like,
smallest category of school.
yeah,
So like
correct. Yeah, thanks for
a
the
high school.
clarification there. Yeah, so my high school at the time was like 350 kids. My graduating class was 75. My sister's was 55, and so we go out to the sticks, and it's mostly rural, white, corn, this and that. But the reality is, we didn't know any better about class, and so showing up on time or saying please and thank you, having good work ethic. I mean, I think those are all just they, and even the books show this that that's when you're blue collar, you only get measured by your results. When you're white collar and you shuffle paper, sometimes the deliverable isn't always as clear or takes longer, especially in politics. But when you're working in a steel mill, like you either forged the ingot or you didn't, right? There's something a little more tangible. Or if you're at the Ford, automotive assembly line, like a few of my uncles were, like when you put the tire on, you see each of those cars go out out the back door, right? And there's a sense of pride and ownership in that. And I think that as we've moved away from using our hands, it's easy to, I think, let work ethic or other things maybe slip because it's hard to quantify maybe what value is. But I think a lot of this translates from the agrarian tradition to an industrial age as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I think your high school mascots were the ingots there, the steel. So it was definitely
Yeah,
steel.
yeah. So which is kind of funny, right? So, so Lake Station and Hobart were busting at the seams from all the migration in the 50s, and so basically the Hobart Township was like, "Hey, we need to do something here," and they call down state and they're like, "We'll give you a loan." And so they build this high school right between Hobart and Lake Station. Like, what do we call it? Again, kind of like Lake Station's for me, like the most practical, common sense anything. We are next to a river, deep river, and behind us is a forest. Well, we're a forest. So what are we going to call ourselves? The Ingots. Why? Well, because steel was in its heyday in the late 50s. The biggest steel strike in American history is 1959 that my Papa was a part of. And but obviously you can't have a block of steel as a mascot. So the actual mascot was Joe Macarak, who is a Croatian immigrant, which is very fitting to Northwest Indiana, and it's totally he's a folklore, mythological figure who can, basically, bend, steel rails and do all these kind of Superman type activities in the steel mill, for good. So it brings, really some maybe some honor as well as dignity to the profession. And so it's kind of neat to be part of, one of the younger schools, I guess you could call it, in the state during a time when, we were still fully, blue collar, hands on kind of society.
So you sort of alluded to this a little bit. What was the sort of racial ethnic makeup when you were maybe in your high school years and before, and how did those people get along? How did they relate?
Yeah, so our school was still predominantly, so all the Gary schools are really no longer in existence due to charters and financial issues. And again, folks, leaving the city. So the population, and I want to note that Gary's population has increased this past year, first time in probably 45, 50 years since sort of say the 80s. And so I played all the traditionally historical public schools in Gary, West Side, Horace Mann, Wirt, Roosevelt, all those. And so there was still, I would say, a high level of segregation in a sense that my high school was about, 2 to 5% black. Overall, it was 60% white, about 35% Hispanic, and a large majority that was Mexican, some Puerto Rican, and then we just had I'd say a good gosh 5 to 10%, I guess we'd call the mutts, the multi-ethnic or the multiracial, which that number I would say has skyrocketed since. And so I always kind of make the joke about with some of my Mexican friends, they tend to be the most intermingling. And so I remember graduating with a gal who was Polish Mexican, and then you've got Mexicans, and they make fun of each other because of the difference in their Spanish and in their rice. And I'm not going to pick sides here. I'm not going to be too partisan, but both food is very, very good. And then my favorite is Czechoslovakian Mexican, which is Chex-Mex. So I think it was neat because and then a lot of the Mexicans that came up in the second wave, the first wave through the strike breakers of the 1919 steel strike were recruited by Inland Steel, straight from Mexico. But the Mexicans I grew up with, a lot of second and third generation, and they have Spanish, you know, their Spanish ethnic, background, and so they would be very, very white during the winter, and you can see from our basketball pictures that you really can't distinguish them other than maybe some facial features. And then by the time cross country season rolled around the next August, they would be the darkest kids in the school. And so when you got some shapeshifters like that, I mean, color just really wasn't a thing. Everything was really about class and really just kind of scraping along. And yeah, I think if there were two classes, and there were the dirty kids, and then there were the rest of us. And the real difference was, if I were to make an assumption here, it was really different between someone who had two parents or one parent. It was the difference between having a daily shower and daily food, and really those bare essentials and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And but outside of that, everyone was pretty much in the same bucket.
Hmm. I had always heard that Northwest Indiana up there was extremely balkanized ethnically. This one guy I know who's Slovak. He grew up in Highland. It's like Highland was the Slovak town, and like the next one may have been like the Polish town or whatever. But it wasn't even race. But it was these different Eastern European ethnicities were very clustered, and they didn't necessarily get along, and they maybe even fought with each other. I mean, was that ever the case, or did that?
Yeah,
fade
that's
by the time you came around, or
yeah. So looking at past 100, what is U.S. Steel 1901, and they built Gary Works 1906, rolled out their first steel in 1908, and so the first you had some native whites originally in the city of Gary, but blacks, came up very early on. I think the earliest was like 1910. I mean, right after U.S. Gary Works was started, but not shortly after that. From essentially 1906 to 1921, Gary had over 50 different ethnicities, mostly Eastern and Southern European. Originally, those Europeans were treated not on par, but maybe a half step better than Black Americans. So they were forced to live in what they call the Black Patch, which had very, very substandard living conditions, lean-tos, no running water, no bathrooms, definitely rat infested, things of that nature. And when Gary started to reach some of its heyday in the 20s, before the Great Depression, there would be Fourth of July parades, and the city would have to separate different ethnic groups that had beef with each other back in the motherland. So they never had issues during those Fourth of July parades, but that's because they were all premeditated to put Group X at the front and Group Y at the back and make sure they don't see or talk to each other. But over time, and once you get to the World War II migration folks, which again in 1921 when we had the Emergency Quota Act that stopped a lot of that European migration. That's when U.S. Steel went and got Southern whites and Southern blacks, and so you started to have a unique mix. And there's plenty of history of discrimination of both groups, but the reality is that at some point those Eastern Europeans, what's really great about them is it allowed them to maintain their ethnic identity. And so we have Pierogi Fest for the Polish, right? We have Serb Fest, things of that nature. But to some degree, they became Americanized, and some folks would say they essentially became white. And so around the late 40s, early 50s, that group of folks really took over the Democratic Party, and they had I think two terms as mayor, or two different mayors were Eastern European, before the election of Gordon Richard Hatcher, the first black mayor, with Carl Stokes of Cleveland, Ohio, 1967, first black mayors. So
yeah, we're
so I
talking about
think
Hatcher as a mayor of Gary.
Mayor of Gary,
Yeah.
correct? Yeah, and I think the unique thing there is that as these different, they called it the rule of last arrival, and so each group that came in would be willing to work for less, and so there was ethnic or racial prejudice against them. And some of the parts of the story that make it interesting is that you know there was interracial solidarity between blacks and whites in 1919, and you had the race riots that were all across the country. Gary was one of the very few places that it did not happen, but that does not mean that discrimination against Black Americans did not exist. It's pretty well documented in a book called Freedom Fighters in Steel, uh, written by a gal in Miller, Gary. And it's with about five or six Black Americans that worked in the steel mills, including in Gary Sheetington, where my papa and dad worked. So, I think over time things have gotten better, certainly, but a lot of folks would say the region historically is not a melting pot. It's more of a salad bowl.
Hmm. And kind of in this environment, how do the politics of someone like Donald Trump play in Lake Station today?
Well, he barely lost it in 2016, I think by 100 or 200 votes, something very, very small. Then he won it by a few hundred votes in 2020, and then he increased his margins in 2024. And I would say, other than again that Black Oak neighborhood or unincorporated Calumet Township, which is essentially part of Gary, that and then maybe parts of East Chicago. There's kind of three little buckets in North Virginia that are truly multiracial. And so, my belief is, those folks are all around the same socioeconomic status. They're not at ground zero. They're maybe on the first rung of that economic ladder. But I would say that they are practical to a fault, in a sense that they're really locked in on economic opportunity. Kitchen table issues are one, two, and three, and so when it comes to folks that are part of the intelligentsia or different income means, I think it's hard for them to relate, because those issues are so backbench for them when it comes to kind of the nature of survival.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the last two election cycles, Lake Station, Donald Trump won Lake Station twice, but also a gay Democrat won as mayor. So definitely people who are willing to split tickets and aren't necessarily partisan.
Yeah, or I think when someone comes to your door and you shake their hand, you think they're honest, and they give you their campaign pitch. I think I remember my dad. There was only one person that's been elected three times in Lake Station. That was Mayor Shirley Wadding, first female mayor, three-time victorious, and she came to our house. She was a Democrat. My dad voted for her, and I think his political leanings were far more conservative to the right. I know my grandparents were Republicans, and so he liked her hearty handshake, and she talked about the basics, paving roads and connectivity to Chicago, and just some real plain Jane kind of things. And he's like, hey, I like this gal, and I think this is who I'm going to vote for. And I remember when I voted. In 20 this is what 6 months before he passed away, not even in 2003 I voted in the Lake Station Democratic primary, and I didn't realize, I didn't know who I was supposed to vote for in the city council. I didn't understand any of this, and I came home and he told me I voted for the wrong person, and he kind of thought it was like the end of the world, and I was kind of like, what is all this voting stuff anyway?
Hmm.
But Mayor Bill, twice elected, first time 2-1, the second time by a 22% margin. He wears, buffalo plaid print, which is basically red and black, flannels. I know everyone would recognize that if they saw it. His husband runs the Lake Station Historical Society, of which I'm going to be donating some River Forest paraphernalia to. And I think that, folks there, as I like to say, they they elected him based on what he's going to do 9 to 5. They're not terribly interested in what he does with his 5 to 9. And so I think, again, we come to the practicality of, paving roads, generally speaking, it isn't a Democrat or Republican issue. It's, whether you think that they should be, golden brick roads or not, right?
So you think a Democrat with a compelling economic pitch could win Lake Station today, president?
Oh, absolutely. It's no doubt. I think there's several journalists, authors that are trying to look at polling and crosstabs and history, and really trying to look at neurolinguistic programming, the words that we use and how they move people. And there is certainly certain ways to drive. It comes back to populism, right? In the same kind of working class issues that were in 1890, at the essentially the beginning of the Gilded Age, we're kind of in that same arena today. And if you recall correctly, Black Americans were very attracted to the populist movement, because again, it was about equal opportunity and raising the standards for everybody, regardless of what they looked and sounded like. And so Democrats can certainly do that, but the opportunity, they have to, their brand has to really be bigger than the parties, in a sense that they have to combat some of the elitism that comes out of DC as it relates to, let's say, a DEI or pronouns, or again, things that really aren't kitchen table issues.
How does this? How does style play, or how much does style matter? Donald Trump's style is extremely off-putting to a lot of upper middle class people. How does that style play, and how do they think about that?
Yeah, well, it's again going back to the history. The Eastern, Central, Southern Europeans, when they came to Gary, right? All 50 ethnicities, they didn't barely know their own language, much less English. And part of the Americanization thing is, like most kids, when you learn a foreign language, you learn the cuss words first, right?
Hmm.
And so, in the steel industry also has a very masculine identity. Even the women that work out there and minorities, whatever, there is certainly it's big, dirty, dangerous, and dominant, and so there's a certain culture that gets wrapped up into that. I think there's a book out there written by a more liberal gal. It's called Rust. Her memoir came out in 2020, and she worked at Cleveland Cliffs in Cleveland for 3 years during the Great Recession. And she's a pretty progressive, white gal, and she was in this mixed bag of folks that were pretty rough and tumble. And so she she was pretty educated. She ultimately, I think she now has like a PhD in English or something along those lines. But she was like, these folks kind of talk a little more crass, and that's always been something when we talk about, the genteel and the planter class back in the agrarian times, and aristocracies is kind of like wearing white after Labor Day. I mean, that's actually a class thing. It has nothing to do with fashion per se, but it's a way for the elite to kind of differentiate themselves. And so, language, in the vocabulary that's used is another thing. So, the thing about Donald Trump is he speaks simply and he speaks frankly, in probably maybe to a fault, but also in a sense that that phonetic use that he has is just very palatable, even though he's totally from a different financial world. And I'd probably attribute being a real estate developer and going down and talking to the people that work on build those
Right.
buildings, to communicate with him. I think that was probably just a natural evolution of his character.
I don't know if it's true, but the story is his dad made him go around collecting rent in the dad's buildings, and so that had to,
I don't know, but I mean that would make sense.
that they he learned to deal with some interesting people,
Yeah.
to say the least. Uh,
Well, hey,
your your story,
it's like campaign door knocking, though. I mean,
yeah.
I got my first fill about 15 years ago, and I tell you what, when when you get to those independents, you're not really sure what's going to happen when you open that door and you've got a survey, and you're trying to understand what their issues are, and you really never know what you're going to get. So I think, and I have a deep respect for the Mormon faith and their missions. I mean, they do the same thing either overseas or even in this country. When you're going door to door trying to sell something, whether it be custom suits, picking up rent, or religion, there's a lot of rejection there. And so learning the language of the people to close the deal, if you will, takes a lot of training and practice. And I think he has that.
So you grew up, son of a steelworker, grandson of a steelworker. You're in this working class milieu, and what happens, and I'll just tell the story briefly, is you were going to go into the military. In fact, you'd sort of like pre-committed when you were underage to going, but it wasn't legally binding because you weren't 18 yet.
Yep.
And you ended up winning a big scholarship funded by the Lilly Endowment to go to college, which puts you on a completely different trajectory in life. And I'm very interested, how did you discover this scholarship? Like, how did you come to get this scholarship? Did somebody
Yeah.
tell you about it? Or, yeah, how did that happen?
Well, essentially, gosh, I think believe it was '95 when, Lilly, as you know, Indiana produces some of the best engineers in the country, maybe world. Whether it's Purdue or Rose-Hulman, Notre Dame. I mean, just a lot of great schools in this state in the STEM area. But what Lilly recognized in growing their own business is, hey, these people like we're training Hoosiers and non-Hoosiers, and they're all leaving, and so they definitely called it the brain drain, and so they started a scholarship in all 92 counties. Was it the Lilly Endowment Community Scholarship? They want me to always use the correct language on that. So, but essentially, I always say I got lucky in a sense that in 2003 they were selling a lot of drugs. The Lilly Endowment was funded purely by their stock. It's not anymore. But at that time, Lake County had 25 public high schools and they gave away 15 scholarships. Now I think they do 4 to 6 in Lake County, so a lot less. There was also a book stipend, but essentially it was the guidance counselor. The Legacy Foundation, which is the largest nonprofit in Lake County, would reach out to all the schools and say, "Hey, you get to submit one person." And kind of the interesting piece of fate here is a good friend of mine received a scholarship in 2000, and he encouraged me to apply. But to be honest, I was a little bit jaded because three of my peers of my graduating class, their parents were on the school board. And I had seen some, I hold no grudges, but I had seen some decisions that were made based on perhaps nepotism or favoritism or something along those lines. So I actually did not apply originally. And so our guidance counselor, Dr. Bob Wright, he basically sent, yeah, we had email, and he sent us an email. He goes, "Not one of you applied. How shameful." I mean, it was like this pretty kind of a nasty gram in a sense of this is a game changer. And then once I realized nobody applied, I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And so, my one-page essay. It's somewhere online, but essentially it was like, what are you going to do for Indiana, and what's your contribution to community, and how's a scholarship going to change your life? And for me, it was, really wanting to be involved in the steel mill, and bring technology to the processes to make us more competitive and less reliant on foreign countries, because I knew that you know fair trade and free trade are not the same thing, even at a young age. And again, my dad was a union, grandfather was a union, knew that there were challenges in that, but also my community service was the 5 years that I took care of my dad, and that became a salient point. And so uh, I was basically selected amongst my peers to represent River Forest High School. And then I remember it was during the winter and it was snowy. I had to drive to Indiana University Northwest in Gary, and I had never been there and was fairly scared. And think about this: I believe I just turned 18, and my first interview is 8-on-1. I mean, I walk into this room with it felt like a corporate board, and I sat down, and I must have sweat 10 pounds of of liquids out, and they really got me to calm down. But one of the most challenging questions I've ever been asked was, "We see on your permanent record that you had Kathy Hooks for both chemistry one and chemistry two. You got a D on your permanent record in chemistry one, but you got an A on chemistry two. So, like, explain this to us." And it got really sensitive, where that was, in 2000, when my dad's ALS was really bad. He moved away for a few months to live with my grandmother, and that was the real first time that I was in a very suicidal state. And there's 5 suicides in my family, including my mother, to this day. And I was in a very dark spot. And having to share that in an interview at 18 and share that vulnerability was tough. But I think one of the things that JD Vance and I both have in common is that we were both awarded scholarships based on socioeconomic status and previous hardships. And I think those things made us better people. But as he says in his own book, that you know in some ways those demons always, they're chasing you to some degree. You never, and I think even in his interview in 60 Minutes or whatever about the book, you never 100% get over it. But the reality is, you have to press forward. And so a couple months later, and I still have the letters from the mail of receiving that award. And in the I saw an article in our it's called the Ingot Informer. It's our community high school newspaper, and they forced everybody to take the ASVAB at our school. That's very unusual. A lot of schools, they don't even tell you about it, or it's voluntary. I remember going to something called the Round. It used to be what was our where we used to have plays. It was a perfect circle with a theater in the middle, and you could cut it up into 4 slices of pie. And they had us all sitting there, and we all took the exam. And to be honest, Aaron, it's the only exam I've ever felt 110% confident, because if you're blue collar, the ASVAB's for you. There was an electrical section, there was a mechanical section, wood shop, all the things I did as a kid. And I scored in multiple categories, like in the 95th percentile in the nation. So as the war in Iraq was getting, kind of fired up, all 4 branches started calling me on my landline at home. Finally, I went and met with a recruiter, a Navy recruiter, my mom, who was a Navy veteran, who went over to the war in Iraq in 2003. She advocated for it. My dad was militantly against it. But just like JD Vance, was that sensitivity. He was afraid to get activated overseas because the condition of his mama. Well, my dad was also he was in year 5 of ALS, and really toward I could tell that the end was closer than most had thought. And so I knew that if I had signed away to go overseas, it was called the delayed entry program. So I signed the paperwork at 17, but since you can't legally contract, the recruiter would just meet with me and say, "Are you still going? Are you still going?" Well, after the Lilly Endowment Scholarship, it was like, "Well, heck no, I'm not going to the war I Iraq. I'm going to college." I have no idea what the heck college is, but I was told it's a ticket to the middle class. And there's an Indiana University professor, Murray Spurmer. He wrote a book called Beer and Circus, and it's basically how schools use sports to recruit kids. And he's a little negative on kind of again, kind of like the Romans. It's beer and circus because that's what they're selling you, not necessarily always an education. And he talks about the different types of kids and why they go to college. And I'm trying to. He think they called me a vocational. I am basically a kid who had no idea what college was. I saw it like Charlie in the chocolate factory. It was merely a ticket, the golden ticket to the middle class. And so at that point, I was definitely going to Purdue, and I'm glad I made that decision because I was able to get my first job in Gary with I mentioned earlier, Kathy Hooks. Her husband owned an engineering firm doing detail and design work for what was then, I think it was Bethlehem. And when I got started, it was after the bankruptcy. It was International Steel Group when Wilbur Ross bought it. And I did that off and on for over 10 years. And, before I went away, so I saved up a couple $1,000s before I went away to Purdue. And my dad passed away just a few months later that October. So it's a huge, I mean, it's amazing how a little fork in the road can happen and put your life on a different trajectory.
I always wonder about how people get on a different trajectory. I grew up. I wouldn't say it was as working class as you. It was rural. It was a very different kind of milieu. And I just got such good grades. Everybody assumed I was going to college, but I got no guidance from anyone. Like it was just
Oh yeah.
so it's like I feel like there's all kinds of people that they need someone to point them.
Hmm.
If somebody doesn't say you need to do this or point you here, you'll never find the door that leads to that escalator, up to the next rung or whatever.
Yeah.
But you found someone at least you had like a guidance counselor who shamed us. Oh, maybe I have a shot at this. What
Yeah,
did
but I
your
think, similar to Vance's memoir, I was given kind of the same, we're the same age, by the way, right? He's 6 months older than me. We're both 40. Vivek Ramaswamy will be 40 this August. So I think, us elder millennials, particularly those of us who were born in 84, 85, we graduated when the war in Iraq started, and then we graduated college if we went, when the Great Recession started. So those are kind of two unique kind of punches in the face, or major social events that are largely influence our religious and political worldview, in a lot of ways. But as Vance said in his book, a lot of his friends or colleagues, peers were like, "Hey, I'm gonna go get a job at Arco, which became AK Steel," and the older folks are like, "Hey, you don't want to do this." And my dad told me that many times. It's well documented. Studs Terkel's Working and several of the books. Steelworkers almost always tell their sons, "You do not want to do this work. It's hell on your body and mind and soul. The money's great, but it's golden handcuffs." But both JD Vance and I were sold the concept of like college, like that is the only ticket. Rap or play basketball, right? It's just college was the only thing, and that really put our country on this trajectory. In college isn't for everybody, and heck, I'm not even sure if it was for me because I really enjoyed using my hands, and I thought I wanted to be an electrician when I was a kid. I wanted to use my mind, but I always liked to move around, and pecking on a keyboard is really not my greatest skill set. But we were never really told about unions or like the building trades or operating engineers or jobs that'll never be outsourced, like being a garbage man or a woman or a plumber or any of these other things that are I think provide a lot of identity, a lot of fulfillment, and they pay really well, and you don't have all the debt. You go into apprenticeship, and I think I just know a lot of folks that are in that space that are my age, and they're some of the happiest people I know.
what did your friends think? Your friends and the other people in the town when they found out you were going to college.
It's interesting in my class, I don't think but 10, out of the 75, I knew maybe 15 that went to college, and I think maybe half of those actually finished. I do think that there really wasn't much segregation in the sense that I only hung out with college people because we all went in different directions. But then every summer when I was an undergrad, I worked in Gary or I worked in Valparaiso. I always still came back and hung out with other friends that I got, little, certificates in massage therapy, or they went and worked in a factory or whatever. And so there was never, I know for some folks, again, like Southern migrants, you move north, you get a fancy job. As Mama would say, you think you're too big for your britches, right? Thinking that you're better than the stock that you came from. And so I didn't, that was never an issue for me. But I can honestly say, and I don't want to, critique the university I graduated from twice, but the more education you get, you do feel a sense of an elitism that the more pieces of paper you accumulate, that you're fundamentally something about you is you are more educated, therefore better positioned to make decisions for the masses. And I even can say in the Great Recession, when I finished my grad degree in 2010, I'd go to Christmas parties and with family and just think like, why the heck did these people not go to college? It wasn't that hard, And the reality is, people have to make their own decisions for various reasons. And I tell you what, I know plenty of steelworkers who can talk about Socrates and Aristotle. I don't know why they became steelworkers, but that doesn't mean that they're not, thinkers in any capacity.
Yeah. I really felt the area I grew up in, Southern Indiana, was skeptical of education going back a long way. And again, I never felt that, but I know other people who did. The guy who lived across the ridge from me, he was probably 5 or 10 years older than me, not quite sure. He told me that when he decided to go to college, the guidance counselor of the school literally told him, this school's way too small for anybody to go to college. Like, discouraged him from wanting to go to college.
That's
And
fortunate.
there was was there any of that kind of in there, like kind of this hostility to education,
Well,
or
I
is
did
that more of
not.
a Southern Indiana thing?
Yeah, so I can tell you, just reading books about steelworkers and some of their resentment with management, where the union ends and management begins, where there's a frustration with some, quote unquote Poindexter 22-year-old with a fancy degree who counts, spreadsheets and, in pardon my French, this would be the Southern saying, he doesn't know shit from apple butter, right? And so there's that tension that, and even my dad said he never had any resentment to people who were educated, but he goes, son, all those fancy grades that you got are good. He's like, that's great. And he always pushed me to get good grades. He was very demanding, but he always used the phrase seat time. And what he meant by that was lived experience. And I think when I look at, author Nassim Taleb, and we think about autodidacts versus academics, or sometimes he calls them IYIs, right? Intellectual yet idiot. I do think there's a little bit of blue collar, or agrarian folks that kind of are skeptical that education really brings the liberal arts, creates the whole person. And I can say that my guidance counselor, I did not do terribly well on the SAT, do not perform well in short, particularly in the language English section. If I only get a minute per question, I'm usually in trouble. Just not being able to think on my feet that fast for those types of things. And he's like, well, you might want to apply to Purdue. It's called Purdue Calumet. It's not Purdue Northwest, but he's like, that's a lot easier engineering school to get into. You can transfer down to West Lafayette later. And so, was he negative? I thought he was at the time, but I think maybe he was a little more realistic that I was not going to get into the School of Engineering at Purdue, which I didn't. I got into the School of Science. And that whole thing is, you need to take a class called Engineering 106, where they grind you out, 40 hours a week for 2 credit hours. And if you pass that, then you've, essentially proven yourself to be in the engineering school. I think IU might have something related to that with the Kelly School of Business, because, they have two completely different schools as well. But I wouldn't say negative, but there was certainly I think they're trying to temper expectations to some degree.
You seem to have a continued connection to the place you grew up, a continued affection for it. Um, I'm like, when I think about where I grew up in rural Southern Indiana, I guess maybe it's because I left home and never came back, and I wasn't caring for my dad, but like, I feel completely disconnected from the culture that I grew up in. I'm not negative towards it. I'm not hostile towards it. I can sit down with somebody and have a beer and like chat with them, but
Mhm.
I feel like, man, everything that I do is it's very like not aligned, with what's going on down there today. Um, how did you stay? What was sort of like, what would you describe as your relationship to the culture, I guess, of Lake Station that you grew up in, sitting
Yeah,
where
well,
you do today? Having worked on Capitol Hill, worked in the State House, um, kind of been at the echelons of power, and like the buildings that you only saw on TV when you were growing up. Now you're
yeah,
working in those buildings, kind of thing.
yeah, which is funny because it was never, as I like to say, politics and public policy and things of that nature. I was very apolitical. I would say even most of the way through college, but it was this thing called the Great Recession, and I graduated with a finance degree the de facto month that it began, December 2007. And my dad always said, if you're honest and you work hard, you'll be successful. And this is 4 or 5 years after he died, and I was like, man, I feel like my dad lied to me, um, and so 2008 was certainly a struggle as I moved to Chicago, Lincoln Park, and Obama got elected, and I was really trying to focus on why I didn't have opportunity, and obviously the financial sector contracted, I think about by about 40%. And I started looking at housing policy, like what caused the Great Recession, MBSs, CDOs, all these financial instruments and how they were traded and what have you. And so I sort of fell into, as I always say, no matter how bad the economy gets, there's always a campaign you can work on that'll pay you. And so that's sort of how I fell into, politics to begin with. But I will say, as it relates to, not my commencement address at River Forest during COVID 5 years ago was inspired by a great uncle that I had talked to. This was the summer of 2005. I was engaged, and my then fiance was. He asked, while we were in school full time, what we did, and she was embarrassed to say that she worked at McDonald's full time. And he responded to her. He goes, um, "Never be ashamed." He goes, "Never forget where you come from, and never be ashamed of what you do for a living." And man, that just planted in me. And that was my theme of my commencement address, which, by the way, River Forest had become 70-30, minority majority. The valedictorian was a black female, salutatorian was Mexican female who gave half of her commencement address in Spanish. And so to me, I've never lost those roots, I would say, primarily because of family. And the core of my identity is watching how I've ran with the elites, particularly in Washington, D.C. I call it the secular triad: PMS, power, money, sex. You use one to get the other, but none of them are ever going to help you live a fulfilling life. And I think that that triad should replace with the other triad, which is faith, family, and community. And so when I come back, when you're on your deathbed, nobody cares how much money you made, what job title you have, what car you drove, what subdivision you lived in. It's going to be the faith, family, and community. That's the things that are going to matter when you're at the end of your life. And so I would say family as I came back home for Thanksgiving or Christmas, right? So other than, my sister has an associate's degree now. I have a cousin she's a teacher. But for the most part, none of my family have degrees. So when I'm around them, I'm around, average folks. And so as a good, intelligent data miner, as a pollster, I'm always, a lot of them don't want to talk about politics too much in a family setting because they, they, they differ a lot with me and with each other. And, but so they have really good etiquette as it relates to family feuds over who does or doesn't like, some think Trump's a savior and everyone thinks he's, Satan, and so, but I think being around working class people, that are your own family, I think that just kind of keeps you rooted, and I think it keeps you grounded. And the reality is that at the end of the day, we're all going to the same place. So thinking that you're better than someone else or whatever, that just doesn't really resonate with me. So I feel fortunate that I'm able to have feet in multiple camps, just like with the Black community in Gary, where I bought my house a couple months ago, which is pretty iconoclastic, for a straight white male Republican Christian, to buy a house in a Black Democrat city. But I tend to culturally vibe with those folks probably more than I do in some of the than more of the affluent communities. So I don't know. Maybe as one friend says, Robert, you're an enigma. So I'm not sure if that's a compliment, but we'll take it.
No, well, thank you for joining me for this podcast. I feel like everybody today talks about the working class, and that's it. We talk about the working class and politics, but very few people actually know much about the reality
Mm.
of the working class. They didn't come. So many people didn't come from those backgrounds. I grew up in middle class suburbia or wherever, which great for them. And so I really wanted to try to bring to life from somebody who really has been in that environment, grew up in that environment, and still has an affection to it. Talk a little bit about it, and how did these places develop? How did they get where they are? How do people think? And so I appreciate you letting me publish your essay and joining me for the conversation today.
Absolutely. I appreciate being on the show. And, I'll leave you with this is that, a lot of times folks are what I call long on education short, unlived experience. And if I have a goal with this podcast is to get folks who, to live outside their comfort zone and reach out and learn more from the people that don't necessarily look, sound, and act like them. And I think there'll be a greater understanding and a mutual drive for a lot of the same outcomes. So, but thanks again. Really enjoyed the show.
Yes, again, my guest today has been Robert Ordway. I'm going to put a link to the article that I mentioned in the show notes and also a link to Robert's Substack. You'll want to sign up for that. Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.